everyone, welcome to this edition, our very first edition of the Ineffable Con Reads. I'm thrilled to note that my bow tie isn't straight. I shall rectify that immediately. There we go. Absolutely lovely to have those of you that are joining us live with us, and lovely to see those of you that are watching later on as well. I sound like one of those recorded TV channels with the replays later on. Never mind. For those of you that want to follow along with the fic that we are reading today, both of the links are in the comments. Both are over on AO3. We're going to start shortly with Journeys by Bus by KittyDorkling. We will say that we are doing this for fun because we have nothing better to do on a Saturday night than get dressed up looking like this and read to you lovely people. We don't profess to be actors in any way, shape or form. For those of you that watched the one that we read a couple of weeks ago, you'll know that already. So really glad that you can join us, and we hope that you enjoy the two fics that we've chosen today. If any of you have recs, please do find us on Twitter at the Ineffable Con and send those over. As long as you enjoy tonight, we will be doing a few more of these.
Okay, so we are going to start off with a lovely soft fic called Journeys by Bus by KittyDorkling. Crowley awakened to the chirping of his phone's alarm and the glorious, familiar sound of traffic outside, angry car horns and the occasional yelling Londoner. Lockdown, it appeared, was over, and he had successfully slept through the whole thing. It was time to get out of his blasted flat. In typical British summertime fashion, it was raining outside, the sort of light spitting that made you feel like a tit with an umbrella up, but still got you wet without one. He sauntered through the streets of Mayfair, jamming parking meters with a thought as he went, and considered where exactly he was headed. He couldn't go straight to the bookshop. That would be pathetic. And besides, the last time they'd spoken, he'd offered to pop over, and Aziraphale had flatly turned him down. No, a demon had to have some self-respect, or at least pretend to. It was barely past lunchtime, still raining, and while Crowley didn't fancy getting any wetter, he didn't want to go back indoors either. The whole thing was a conundrum, so it was without any real plan that he found himself waiting at a stop where the number 19 bus would shortly be calling. There were always plenty of opportunities for temptations on there, and he could look out the windows and definitely not think about past meetings with Aziraphale. Perfect. Boarding the bus, Crowley waved a slim black plastic card at the payment doodad, ignoring the driver and other passengers' attempts to hand him the paper ticket issued, and swung his way up to the stairs to the top deck, where he halted so abruptly the passenger behind bumped into him. "Angel," he choked out. Aziraphale was sitting exactly where they would usually meet for a rendezvous, his hands fiddling in his lap and his gaze cast down in the vague direction of the empty seat next to him. An air of melancholy surrounded the angel, and he didn't look up until he heard Crowley's voice.
Crowley? What on earth are you doing here? Yelped
Aziraphale, instantly flustered into something close to outrage. "Never mind that. What are you doing here?" retorted Crowley, still fixed to the spot. There wasn't a meeting, was there? That would be seriously embarrassing, but no, he'd checked his voicemail twice before leaving the house, and despite a dozen or so missed calls, Aziraphale definitely hadn't left a message. Not at any point in the last 2 months.
I'm running errands, Crowley. I should have thought that was obvious. And I'm on the bus because, need I remind you, I do not have a motor vehicle, unlike other persons I could mention.
"Oi, do you mind?" said a voice behind Crowley, sounding equally displeased. "Some of us want to sit down." Scowling, Crowley stalked forward, and for reasons that could only be explained by the sheer discombobulation of suddenly finding his angel in so familiar a spot that was nonetheless exactly where he'd least expected to see him, he found himself swinging down into the seat directly behind Aziraphale.
"Oh,"
said Aziraphale, looking, if anything, yet more flustered.
"I usually imagine you behind. That is to say, if I were imagined sitting. I mean, you do tend to sit behind, but I suppose there's not really any need for such precautions anymore."
"What errands are you running exactly?" asked Crowley, interrupting before the angel could get himself into any more of a tizzy. Aziraphale blinked for a moment, collecting himself, then sagged into his seat slightly. He looked careworn.
"I hadn't thought, actually. I just wanted to get out of the shop now lockdown's been lifted. I was getting a bit tired of sitting there alone, surrounded by all that cake."
"Haven't eaten it all yet, then?"
No, rather gone off it if I'm being quite honest. It just isn't the same without company.
Is that so? Said Crowley, allowing himself to sprawl a little more comfortably at last, one long leg extended across the aisle to casually inconvenience anyone attempting to pass. Aziraphale's knee was warm against his own, and he savoured the tiny point of contact. It had been weeks now since they'd seen each other, not a long time in the overall scheme of things, but considerably more unusual since Armageddon Oopsie. It was nice to know the angel had missed him a little after all.
I don't suppose you'd like to...
began Aziraphale, hopefully, letting the end of the sentence hang in the air unspoken. Right, yeah, be good to catch up, agreed Crowley. Not that he'd actually been doing much other than sleep, but that was beside the point. Should we get off at the next stop, then? Aziraphale hummed. He sounded unconvinced.
We could, of course, but I wonder if it wouldn't be nice to, well, take the scenic route.
The scenic route of the number 19 bus. Crowley forbore to point out the route would actually take them further away from Soho the longer they travelled.
Of course, we don't have to.
No, that's fine, conceded Crowley. Whatever you like, Angel. Aziraphale was getting twitchy again, fidgeting in his seat like a toddler, which usually meant he was trying to make himself say something difficult. Crowley waited patiently, fighting down a smile of fondness. It was very good to see him, not that he was about to break the delicate equilibrium of their friendship by mentioning it. Outside, the rain dribbled down the bus's windows. If Aziraphale didn't say something soon, Crowley was going to be forced to comment that it appeared to be easing off a bit now, and perhaps the afternoon might turn out sunny.
Do you remember the bus from Tadfield?
Aziraphale burst out almost a full 2 minutes later, and just in time to save Crowley from talking about the weather. Vividly. The word was out of his mouth before Crowley could think better of it. Aziraphale laughed, slightly hysterical.
Same here, isn't it funny? All the things that happened that day, and it's that silly old bus ride that really sticks in my memory. Ridiculous, quite ridiculous.
Aziraphale, Crowley couldn't help noticing, had stopped fiddling with his heavenly signet ring, and his left hand now lay slightly awkwardly atop his thigh. Well, that was likely to be the best invitation Crowley was going to get for the next century. Slowly, cautiously, the heart he didn't really need racing at what felt like several hundred beats a minute, he moved his own right hand with the kind of precise care that would have won any Jenga competition on the planet until it rested, very gently, upon Aziraphale's. The angel, still facing resolutely forwards, let out a tiny, shaky breath and turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through Crowley's and squeezing gently. Did you know, said Crowley conversationally, as if something of seismic, universe-shaking significance had not just happened, that a modern London bus has a maximum speed of 65 miles per hour, and yet most of them travel at an average of under 10. In central London, it's more like 5.
Is that so?
Asked Aziraphale faintly. Which is to say, I suppose, Crowley lowered his voice a little, I hope this isn't going too fast for you. Said Aziraphale, turning towards him in surprise. He swallowed, took a breath, and slowly a tentative smile spread across his face, quite the loveliest thing Crowley had ever seen since the last time Aziraphale had smiled at him. The drizzle outside was indeed beginning to clear, and a sunbeam slanted through the dirty window, illuminating the angel's curls like a halo.
I see. No, my dear. I think perhaps this is going at exactly the right speed.
Crowley grinned back, too elated to even pretend nonchalance, and risked a small squeeze of his own. After several centuries of breakdowns, cancellations, exceptionally slow progress, and the occasional reverse and rerouting, London bus journeys seemed a fairly apt metaphor for their relationship. The Australian War Memorial hove shortly into view, and Crowley reached up to ding the stop request button and stood, dropping Aziraphale's hand from his. He started down the stairs while the bus was still slowing to a grinding halt, much to Aziraphale's unconcealed dismay. Come on, Angel, sun's out. We can walk back to yours through the park, announced Crowley, ignoring the huffing protests behind him until they both disembarked and were standing on the pavement once more. He held out his hand to Aziraphale, who stared at it for a moment in confusion before suddenly smiling again, more widely than before.
Goodness,
said Aziraphale, and reached to take it with a delicious little wiggle of joy. His palm was warm and soft against Crowley's.
A walk through the park, you say? That sounds lovely.
And then, said Crowley, with more cheer than he could remember since the world hadn't ended, I can miracle a few bottles over and watch you eat all that cake. Behind them, the number 19 bus rolled on along its route, the the driver's sciatica mysteriously eased and all its passengers feeling just that little bit more cheerful. It made slow progress through the London traffic, but it was definitely moving forwards, at least. The end.
Thank you very, very much to KittyDorkling for that one. Really just a sweet little fic, isn't it?
It is very sweet.
It's
And I got to hold your hand
and
out
she
of you
got
with the
to
camera.
hold my hand.
It's always nice.
That is all that she is holding out of you, of the camera. This is a safe for work show, gentle peeps.
It is indeed. I need some wine before the next one. So you can tell we're doing this live because I screw up all the time. Sorry, not an actor.
And I'm cheating. I don't have cocoa in this. I have Ribena. For those of you in other countries that don't have Ribena, I pity you. I will send you some Ribena.
This is actual wine, though, because I need it. Okay, shall we? We are going to proceed with our second story for this evening, which was recommended to us by JC. It is England's Pleasant Pastures Scene by Squiddz. And the summary of this one is Crowley takes Aziraphale out for the day and overhears a conversation that melts his heart a little. That is literally the plot. It's
just
great.
some pointless fluff to brighten your day. Yes, we've had a lot of rain here, so some pointless fluff hopefully will go down as well with you as it will with us.
And it also starts, like the last one, with Crowley waking up. There's a theme. Crowley drifted into consciousness to the muted sounds of London morning traffic. He shifted a little on the old-fashioned down-filled mattress. He still wasn't entirely used to Aziraphale's bed, which was nowhere near as big or luxurious as the one in his own flat. But there were some perks to it, namely the warm body resting beside him. He smiled lazily as a hand ran through his hair, and he finally opened his golden eyes to look at Aziraphale lying next to him, cast in the gentle glow of the early morning sun.
Good morning, my love,
Aziraphale said, still stroking Crowley's hair. Morning, Angel, he replied, voice thick with sleep. It was still something of a novelty to let their feelings tumble out so freely. Aziraphale planted a kiss on Crowley's forehead and sat up, swinging his legs out over the edge of the bed. Cold air rushed in to fill the empty space next to Crowley, and it made him shudder. He watched Aziraphale casually miracle his pajamas into his familiar daytime clothing, then reached into a pocket on his waistcoat to pull out a tartan tie. He always insisted that he put on his bow tie the human way, and Crowley loved to watch his clever hands at work.
What are you doing with yourself today, dearest?
Aziraphale asked as he flicked the tie over his head and pulled it against the nape of his neck. Crowley's eyes traced the lines of Aziraphale's face and profile, delicately outlined in yellow gold, eyes downturned in concentration, tips of his hair glowing in the sunlight. Not that long ago, Crowley would have only allowed himself a moment's glimpse of this, just long enough to imprint the image in his mind to recall later during a lonely night. With a contented sigh, he stretched and slithered across the bed to rest his head next to Aziraphale's thigh. Well, I can think of something I'd like to do right now, but it does involve you getting back into bed. Crowley could just about make out the arch of an eyebrow from this angle.
As tempting as that may be,
Aziraphale said with a grin.
I'm afraid I don't have time.
His manicured fingers pinched and pulled at the fabric of his tie, weaving it into a neat bow. Crowley propped himself up on his elbow, resting chin on hand, and furrowed his brow. Wait, where are you off to? Aziraphale let out a small noise of annoyance.
Really, Crowley, we talked about it yesterday. There's a rare books collection near Reading. I managed to persuade the chief curator to let me take their illustrated version of Salome off their hands.
He paused, smiling the same bright smile Crowley usually only saw over a plate of pastries.
It'll be just the ticket for my wild collection.
The conversation from the night before floated to the surface of Crowley's memory. He was fairly sure he could remember Aziraphale talking excitedly about something as they lay on the sofa in the back room, but he was also fairly sure he'd not been listening to any of it. In his defence, it was incredibly difficult to concentrate on anything when he had his head in Aziraphale's lap. Alcohol may also have been involved. Oh, right, yeah, sorry. Then, after a moment, persuade. Aziraphale's back stiffened a little, and he looked off to the side, away from Crowley.
Yes.
You wouldn't have happened to use your angelic influence to procure a book now, would you? Aziraphale let out a tired sigh as his shoulders sank a little.
Oh, it's not like I'm stealing it. I've been providing them with some materials from my collection for their research. The curator wanted to give me something in return anyway. I just helped her to feel better about parting with something so exquisite. And stop laughing at me, Crowley.
I'm not laughing, replied Crowley, who had been unable to stop an amused smirk spreading across his face.
You are as good as laughing. Anyway, I've not got time for this. I have about 13 minutes before I need to be at Paddington, and I don't want to turn up to Sindlesham looking like some kind of layabout.
Yes, well, that's definitely my first thought when someone turns up at my rare books collection with their bow tie slightly askew. Aziraphale had evidently now decided to ignore Crowley's provocations, opting instead to fuss over some minor adjustments to his tie. Crowley flipped over onto his back and watched him. The thought of spending the day without Aziraphale sounded a little disappointing. In fact, it sounded downright boring. Why don't I drive you? He asked. Aziraphale's hands stilled, and he glanced down at Crowley, sprawled out ridiculously along the bed.
Really?
Yeah, sure, Crowley drawled. It's not that far. Then he quickly added, and yes, I'll use the human speed limits, don't look at me like that. Be a nice drive, I think. Aziraphale twisted his torso to lean over Crowley, reaching out to cup the demon's cheek.
All right, that does sound nice, he said, a mischievous smile forming on his lips. Aziraphale's hands slid down over cheekbone, throat, collarbone, until finally drawing a line gently down the middle of Crowley's exposed chest with his index finger. Crowley shivered at the playful touch. You will have to put some clothes on, however. Crowley grinned devilishly and grabbed Aziraphale's face with both hands, pulling him down for a quick kiss. Oh, that's unfortunate, he said, sitting up, but I think I can manage. He pushed himself out of bed and stood up, fully clothed and hairstyled. He reached into the inside of his jacket, pulled out a pair of sunglasses, and flicked them onto his face in a single fluid motion. Right then, shall we? It was a British pastime to complain about the weather. It just wasn't small talk if no one uttered the phrase, terrible weather this, eh? As far as Crowley was concerned, the Brits had no idea how good they had it. It did not rain nearly as much as people thought it did. Admittedly, Crowley's benchmark for lots of rain was the Great Flood, but no one on this blessed island was building arks, which was a good start. And there were certainly plenty of downright lovely days, which was even better. Today was one of those lovely days. So as the Bentley tore down the M4 under a cloudless sky, Crowley felt a smug satisfaction in both his dismissal of British meteorological concerns and his idea to take himself and Aziraphale for a drive. He glanced to his left over his sunglasses at Aziraphale sitting in the passenger seat and watching the English countryside blur past in quiet contentment. He sighed. It's beautiful outside of the city, Aziraphale said fondly. I forget how much green there is out here. There's green bits in London, Crowley offered. I'm not sure it counts if you can still smell the car exhaust fumes. You don't think Blake meant Hyde Park when he was talking about England's pleasant pastures, then? Aziraphale chuckled. I'm fairly sure the entirety of Greater London falls under the purview of dark satanic mills. Crowley smiled and turned his eyes back out towards the road in front of him. A comfortable silence settled inside the cabin of the Bentley. It wasn't that long ago that Crowley would have immediately jumped on trying to fill these moments with inane, nervous chatter, he reflected. It was a relief after millennia of looking over their shoulders to finally be able to simply enjoy each other's company. And they'd been enjoying it a lot in the 8 months it said saved the world. Their relationship had changed shape in that time, too. It had started with a hand brushing a knee in the car, or a head leaning back against a shoulder after a bit too much wine. Then it was shy fingers entwined together while walking through the park and chaste kisses after an evening out together. Before they'd known it, the two had settled into a pleasant routine that humans might call dating. Crowley stole another sideways glance towards the passenger seat, where Aziraphale had returned to watching the world fly past them out the window. A swell of affection rippled through his chest. We should take a trip, he said. Proper one, I mean. Go away for a little bit together. Aziraphale turned his head to look at Crowley and cocked it to the side. Where did you have in mind? He asked. Anywhere you like, Crowley replied. Maybe Paris or Rome. Been a while since we were there last. Aziraphale's brow knit together in the confused expression he often wore when thinking something over. Crowley's eyes flitted down to the dashboard of the car. He gritted his teeth when he realised the needle on the speedometer was hovering over 95 and eased up on the accelerator. Or, we could just head over to Tadfield one weekend, he said casually as he could muster. I imagine Italy's quite a different place from the last time either of us saw it.
Aziraphale said with a thoughtful smile.
It would be lovely to go back and visit.
Yeah, it would. Crowley looked over at Aziraphale with a sardonic smile. Wonder if that Nero fella is still in charge.
Oh, for goodness sake, I'd rather not be reminded of him.
Aziraphale proceeded to rant extensively about tyrannical Roman emperors as the Bentley sailed down the motorway under the late morning sun. They pulled up in front of exactly the sort of building that Crowley would have pictured containing a rare books collection. It was an old stately home that now belonged to the National Trust or English Heritage or one of those sorts of organisations. It was another thing Aziraphale had likely mentioned last night while he was busy not paying attention. He parked the Bentley in the gravelly field that served as the car park, getting as close to the building as he could, right next to a sign that proclaimed it to be Sindlesham Hall. As he stepped out of the car, Crowley heard a voice calling out from the passenger side. "Mr. Fell, welcome, it's so good to meet you," said a woman that looked exactly like the sort of person Crowley would have pictured as the chief curator of a rare books collection. She was smartly dressed, with short grey hair and a pair of square glasses perched on her nose. She was standing on the last step of the stone staircase at the front of the building, reaching a hand out towards an approaching Aziraphale.
Dr. Sykes, I presume?
Aziraphale said, taking her hand briefly.
It's an honour. Thank you ever so much for agreeing to see me.
Aziraphale beamed, kindness radiating out from him, and Dr. Sykes smiled right back. Crowley had stopped a few steps behind Aziraphale, shoving his hands into the pockets of his black jeans, and was now realising he had drawn the attention of the curator, who was clearly having trouble passing the travel companion of Mr. Fell, rare books collector. Crowley bristled involuntarily.
"Oh, and this is... Anthony,"
Aziraphale cut in, trying to smooth out his slight stutter. Crowley smiled awkwardly and gave a short wave. "Hiya." "It's lovely to meet you, Anthony," Dr. Sykes managed, clearly confused but still resolutely polite. "You can browse the museum if you like. We try and limit the number of people we allow in the library." Then, in the grand English tradition of avoiding coming off as rude at all costs, she added hastily, "It's to preserve the books, you see, nothing personal." Crowley shrugged casually. "Oh, it's all right. Sacrifice I'm willing to make for the sake of the books." Aziraphale shot him a look, and Crowley suppressed an impish grin. The angel took up conversation with Dr. Sykes again, and Crowley followed the two of them up the worn stone stairs, through a set of ostentatiously heavy oak doors, and into a large open hall. Dr. Sykes ushered Aziraphale towards a corridor labelled Orangery and West Wing. The angel paused, excused himself, and leaned in toward Crowley.
"It won't be long, dear,"
he said, nearly a whisper. Then he pointed an accusatory finger at him.
"And be good."
Crowley put a hand to his chest in mock outrage. "You wound me." Aziraphale disappeared down the corridor, and Crowley was left to explore the museum. It was nothing to write home about, especially for someone who had all the museums of London at their disposal. The displays were mostly about the history of the manor, glass cases full of the small personal effects of some boring old men who died centuries ago. He sauntered over to an obnoxiously tall portrait of a former duke, or baron, or viscount, or some equally baffling title, and stared up at the cracked oil painting. A familiar prickling sensation crept up the back of Crowley's head, cold and unwelcome. It was something he was well accustomed to, the feeling of being watched. He craned his neck to the side and spotted an elderly couple standing next to a rack of pamphlets over by a wall, shooting him some rather scandalised looks. Crowley swallowed the growl that threatened to roll out of his throat. He briefly considered transforming into something horrible or making it look like the painting had burst into flames. Then he remembered Aziraphale's plea and opted instead for a slightly unsettling smile. The pair at least had enough decency to look embarrassed that they'd been caught staring, and Crowley was briefly satisfied. Eventually, he got bored of wandering around the handful of unremarkable artefacts. He collapsed into a bench next to the entrance of the West Wing, slouching with little to no regard for the workings of the human skeleton. His head rolled back to lean against the cold wall behind him. The elderly couple, he was sure, was still looking appalled that he'd been prowling around the place, and he had seen the guide sitting behind the tourist information desk staring at him too. He took in a deep breath and tried to push those pompous twats out of his mind. The place smelled like old wood and mildew, which meant it smelled exactly like the bookshop, and Aziraphale. Crowley decided to think about taking Aziraphale to Rome. He pictured taking him to dinner at a romantic restaurant, drinking coffee with him in some hidden cafe, perhaps finding somewhere to have oysters. His thoughts were interrupted by a pair of voices drifting down the corridor next to him.
I can't thank you enough,
came Aziraphale's voice. Oh, really? It's no bother, said Dr. Sykes in a placating tone. You've been so helpful with my research. It's the least I could do. Crowley started gathering his limbs into a less nonsensical configuration, readying himself to stand up. And besides, I'm confident I'm letting it go to good hands, the curator's voice continued. If the state of that car you arrived in is anything to go by, you certainly know how to look after antiques.
Oh, the Bentley,
came Aziraphale's response.
I'm afraid I can't take any credit for that. It's my husband's car, Anthony's, I mean.
The words hit Crowley like a punch in the chest, knocking the wind out of him entirely and jolting him upright. He repeated the words in his own head. My husband's car. Oh, replied Dr. Sykes, sounding startled. Oh, you and Anthony. I didn't realise. Well, he seems to know what he's doing. Aziraphale chuckled. Yes, I'm convinced he loves the thing more than he loves me. Oh, I understand entirely. My wife is an art dealer, and trust me, if it was between me and the Galgan, I know who should save in a fire. The rest of the conversation was lost to Crowley. Everything else had faded into insignificance. His heart swelled, brimming with so much love and affection that he felt certain it would burst his chest wide open. His face was hurting, and Crowley belatedly registered that he'd been sitting there with a ridiculous smile plastered to his face for some time now. A sound halfway between a laugh and a sob fell from Crowley's lips as he realised what a sorry excuse of a demon he was right now. But he also realised that he wanted nothing more than to run into the middle of the hall and shout at the top of his lungs that he loved his husband. His husband! Crowley drew in a breath, deciding the best course of action was in fact to pull himself together before he did something exceptionally embarrassing. Crowley dragged himself up from the bench and in front of the entrance to the corridor just in time to see Aziraphale appear alongside Dr. Sykes. He was holding a book-sized parcel to his chest, wrapped neatly in brown paper and twine. Crowley swore that the smile on the angel's face was lighting up the dingy hall. Oh, hello, Anthony, Aziraphale said, stopping in his tracks. Hello, Angel, he replied brightly. He was sure he saw Dr. Sykes smile a little wider. Aziraphale turned to the curator to say his goodbyes. Thank you once again, he said. And do keep in touch. Of course. Dr. Sykes then looked to Crowley. Safe travels back to London. Crowley tipped his head in acknowledgement. He then turned on his heel and swung out his elbow towards Aziraphale. Shall we? Aziraphale froze momentarily before curling his hand around the crook of Crowley's arm. Oh, certainly. The two of them walked side by side towards the door. Crowley looked back over his shoulder at the elderly couple still pottering around the hall. He lifted his sunglasses with a finger and gave them both a cheery wink, feeling a guilty thrill at the dumbfounded looks on their faces. Once they were outside on the stoop of the manor, Crowley stopped and looked over at Aziraphale into those ethereal blue eyes that had captivated him for thousands of years. His chest was aching by this point, and he was still smiling like an idiot. Aziraphale gave him a quizzical look before Crowley leaned in and kissed him on the lips. I was just waiting to see whether she was going to do that then. Goodness, you're in a far better mood than I thought I'd find you in, he said, chuckling. Crowley shrugged, the smile refusing to leave. What, it's so hard to believe I might have enjoyed my morning in Sindlesham Hall Museum? Incredibly so, Aziraphale replied. I'll have you know I learned a great deal about some 18th century English nobleman whose name eludes me. Yes, very convincing. Crowley pressed his forehead to Aziraphale's, his expression becoming tender. And, you know, I've just enjoyed getting to spend some time with my husband. Aziraphale pulled back from Crowley, eyes wide and owlish. He opened his mouth, managing only to splutter a few sounds. You're... what? Oh, goodness, you heard what I said earlier. At this point, the angel had turned a delightful shade of pink. Crowley filed this moment away for later under make fun of Aziraphale at a more opportune moment. I'm sorry, I'm not entirely sure why I said it, Aziraphale said sheepishly. It just sort of came out. There just didn't seem to be any other English word that fully described what you are to me, or in any language, really. The ache in Crowley's chest was becoming unbearable at this point. Angel, no, don't apologise. It was lovely. He leaned in to press another kiss onto his lips, slow and languid this time, trying to pour every ounce of that overflowing golden warmth into it. Excuse me.
We don't have time for slow and languid.
I love you, he said, once he'd pulled free.
Well, that's very convenient because I love you too,
Aziraphale said, rubbing the tip of his nose against Crowley's. Crowley drew in a steadying breath, pulled Aziraphale's arm close, and began guiding the two of them down the steps of the building. You know, I'm in no rush to get back home, he mused. What would you say to spending a bit more time in England's green and pleasant land? Aziraphale laughed, a sound that sent Crowley's heart soaring.
I would say that sounds marvellous,
Aziraphale replied. An excited smile appeared on his face, one that Crowley recognised in an instant.
How about we find somewhere for lunch?
Crowley squeezed Aziraphale's arm at his side. Now, how could I possibly say no to a date with my husband? The end.
As we promised.
Yes, Jojo,
lovely
this
soft
is the
fics.
most wholesome content.
Yes, I loved husbands in the chat. I could just see that out of the corner of my eye underneath my Shire Horse fringe I've got going on at the moment. Lockdown hair for the win. Thank you very, very much indeed for joining us for the past half an hour. If this is something that you've enjoyed, if you'd like to see more of it, please do let us know, not in a sycophantic way. We just don't want to be here talking to ourselves. So if there's a fic that you'd like to see, please do let us know. Thank you to everyone who's given us recommendations so far. We've got a good list going on, and it certainly helps to keep us busy reading them all and choosing what we are going to do.
Yes, so do let us know if there's anything you'd like to see us do. And thank you very much for joining us. And we will see you next time. I can't remember the date off the top of my head, otherwise I would say it. But in the meantime, we will hopefully see you at the
Round Robin.
The Round Robin.
Which is tomorrow.
You can find details on the... We're making this safer work, aren't we? STFH Pestilence Twitter page and their website. So we hope to see you there tomorrow. Have a pleasant evening. Good night.
Night.